The world has kind of become an angry place. Everyone feels subtly cheated of something. Why is it all happening now?
Ihr Herren, die ihr uns lehrt, wie man brav leben und Sünd und Missetat vermeiden kann. Erst kommt das Fressen, dann kommt die Moral.
This video is the long story behind how we got here, behind all the events we're seeing today. Boy, this will be one long and ugly story. I'm sorry, guys. You see, there was a time when the world actually seemed to be working. And if there ever was something like a golden age, I would say it was the first 30 years after the Second World War. It was the fear of the Soviet Union that led world leaders to cut a bit back on their lower impulses and make sure that workers had more to lose than just their chains. Of course, having a blank slate to work with after the war and strong unions made for a good start. This story exists in 3 slides. For one, every increase in productivity directly translated into workers' wages, meaning if workers produced more, they also earned more. This is why the bottom 90% of earners made all the gains in this era and not the 1%. And this resulted in the lowest inequality in world history. Not just in the US, but in nearly all Western countries. What made this system of worker-friendly politics work despite many countries today doing the same and failing is that it really was the whole thing. For one, finance could not speculate. The New Deal and similar laws ensured that investment actually meant investment, while money wasn't allowed to leave the country. At the same time, high trade barriers created a nationalized economy in which labor only had to compete locally, not globally. In short, being good to your workers back then wasn't a competitive disadvantage. But we should not forget that the whole framework this existed in was much more benevolent. The Fed, for example, once had a commitment. But the very fact that you are watching this video means that something, somewhere, went terribly wrong. We are not living in this golden age anymore. And that is because it all came crashing down when the system came out of balance. This bit is not gonna make me popular, but perhaps workers should have calmed down a bit. Towards the end of the 60s, wage demands kept speeding up because literally anyone could get a job simply by walking into a store. And so to get workers to work for you, you had to pay through the roof. After all, there was permanent full employment. But business can only keep paying for higher wages if productivity increases even faster, for example, through technology. Otherwise, wages will begin to eat away from profits. And once profits are gone, you'll simply have to raise prices. This is how we ended up with sometimes double-digit inflation worldwide in the 70s, because inflation is simply prices rising. But even this would have been okay. But what was more sinister was the accompanying unemployment. You see, when profits have been eaten up by wages, there isn't any money left to invest. And on top of that, without any profits, you're not going to take out any loans either. As investment disappeared, the economy began to stagnate and eventually unemployment shot up. This is the infamous stagflation of the 70s, and contrary to popular belief, the oil crisis only played an accelerating part in it. What should have been done now was to crash the economy a tiny bit, cool wages down and wait for profits to return. And this is what Carter, the well-meaning, actually did in '79. But it's not like recessions make you popular, and the damage had already been done. After 10 years of hardship, people were desperate for something new. I don't know, but if I were part of the 1%, this would be the ideal moment to fund the revolution I've been waiting for. Perhaps as payback for the inflation that ate up my wealth, my disappearing profits, and my workers getting too confident. Why not just take an old ideology down from the attic again, slap a neo in front of it, and people surely won't notice that the system is getting rigged against them again. Make of it what you want, but perhaps the rise of neoliberalism was inevitable. Someone at the London School of Economics already predicted in 1944 that a system centered around workers' rights would eventually blow up through inflation and a subsequent revolt of business. And he was right. Perhaps the story was all too predictable. Perhaps the oil crisis just accelerated the inevitable. But as so often with these large historical narratives, the details of the story is where it's at. In the US, the story goes like this. In 1971, a corporate lawyer named Louis Powell was appointed to the Supreme Court by Nixon to more fairly represent business in a world that was increasingly labor-friendly. In an act of goodwill, he sent a memo to the US Chamber of Commerce that would later act as a blueprint for corporate influence. Keep in mind, this is only the tip of the iceberg, and we only have this document because it was later uncovered by a journalist. In this memo, he appealed to the business community to present a counter-narrative to the status quo, which more and more nagged at their profits. After all, why should business have it ever harder in an economy that is booming? What Powell proposed was a comprehensive attack on public opinion. Business should push a narrative of the regressive left academia and demand fair representation on campuses. It should push its own narrative on TV and in print, and it should put out as much academic work as possible. And the fact that this memo had its impact, or at least expressed the business community's feeling at the time, can be seen in the growing number of think tanks in the US. They were critical in dispensing the academic side of things. By acting as a gatekeeper and only pushing business-friendly ideas, they managed to slowly change the intellectual environment. And when in 1973 crisis hit, their new economic ideas were embraced with open arms. At the same time as the intellectual field was changing, public opinion also changed. Just like today, economic discontent directly fueled into populism. And while in the beginning, the alternative still seemed to be hard-left politics, the counterculture quickly got taken over by a new populist right. With their stories of American virtues and hard work, they gave people their perfect scapegoat, namely the welfare state. Over time, a former union leader arose as the figurehead of this new populism. His name? Ronald Reagan. And while Jimmy Carter had just commanded Paul Volcker, the chief of the Fed, to produce a recession, which would later actually fix stagflation, the intellectual dark web ran against him for election. In the UK, the story was similar yet different. In 1979, the famous winter of discontent hit, which ultimately was just a peak of 6 years of malaise, consisting of strikes, failing businesses, and a mismanaged economy. The attractive alternative? The newly formed neoliberal wing of the Tories. A backbencher named Margaret Thatcher had just established her ideas in a party, in part through a network of well-funded think tanks. And with the Labour Party failing to get the economy back on track, winning was all too easy.
But the point is that millions of your fellow workers are already voting Conservative, and that's not disloyalty, that's common sense.
Don't just hope for a better life. Vote for one.
And just to show you that this is a global move, neoliberalism came to power in Germany through government internal plays. In 1982, the libertarian FDP broke the coalition with the SPD because Chancellor Schmidt refused to implement the extremely neoliberal policies as proposed by this FDP paper. After exiting the coalition, the FDP formed a new government with the Christian Democrats, under the condition that neoliberal policies would be implemented. And of course, Germany is still neoliberal to this day. And the story really is different, yet kind of the same for every country. Sometimes neoliberalism was implemented democratically. Sometimes it was through coups, and sometimes through structural adjustment programs by the IMF. In the end, a wave of neoliberalism swept the world. And we are still suffering from it to this day.
Once you begin a great movement, there's no telling where it'll end.
what marks the global change to neoliberalism is a series of fundamental changes to labor policy, trade and finance. In the US, the turning point for organized labor was the Padco strike. In the UK, it was the coal miners' strike. And through a series of laws and adjustments, sometimes more obvious, sometimes less, the world became rigged against organized labor. At the same time, finance was allowed to go wild. Much of the achievements of the New Deal were simply thrown out of the window, and Wall Street was allowed to create metaphysical value again. Bubble after bubble formed, as rich people simply didn't know what to do with their money anymore. And most importantly, the world became globalized. If money didn't like your labor laws, or taxes, or regulation, you better change it, or it moves abroad. From now on, everything will be produced by whoever can endure the worst conditions. And all of this was justified under a nice framework of academic theories that all seem to make perfect sense of the world. They seem natural to us today. But it's a neoliberal world, and until we think outside the box again, things will continue going wrong.
Fundamentally, most elections are about the economy. That has always been true. What's striking about the polling in this one is how many voters say they want profound change to the U.S. economy. Young people famously say they identify with socialism pretty strongly. The question is, why is that? So my theory, and I think it's right, is that a lot of young people say they want real economic change because the current economy is not working for them, and the boom that we're seeing in markets isn't reflected in the economy they experience. Do you think that's true?
The top story, because 2020 is looking a lot like 2019. More new records.
In term, you risk having upheavals in your society.
I don't want to abolish government. I simply want to reduce it to the size where I could drag it into the bathroom and drown it in the bathtub.
Lives.
What I don't understand is why this isn't causing alarm bells to go off. If your young people can't form families, by definition, your society will become less stable, but nobody seems to care. Why is that? That is really prescient. Nobody is talking about that. You're one of the very few who is, and I'm always grateful when you come on the show. Thank you, Professor.
Pleasure.
It's time for some data, because many people even doubt that the economy is going wrong today. For one, there's all the data from the beginning. After the 1980s, the difference between what workers produced and what they earned started to be pocketed by the capital share of income, which in normal language means those who already have money, so the rich. This leads the top 1% of the population earning all the gains now, rather than the bottom 90%, whose incomes have been stagnating since the 1970s at best and declining at worst. And this, of course, leads to inequality shooting up. This is the inequality spread for the US. But here's the one for Japan, Europe, and pretty much everywhere you can think of. This leads to outrageous statistics like this one. This is who has been earning how much more since the 1980s in Western countries, with the x-axis being what percentile of income the person belongs to. The poorest person on the left here has not made any gains in income, while the richest person on the right here has basically made all the gains. In fact, only the top 10% made any significant gains at all. Anyway, stagnant wages would only be mildly fucking outrageous if prices had stayed the same. But if you look at the details, it's pretty clear why millennials have to eat avocado toast now. While it is true that prices on average have only risen so and so much, and if you compare them with income, they both almost cancel out, what prices in particular have risen make the story interesting. All the stuff that young people need, like childcare, education and housing, have gotten a lot more expensive, while all the stuff that everyone benefits from, like consumer goods, have gotten dirt cheap. This is where a lot of the intergenerational conflict comes from. Boomers get all of the fun stuff because they already have their houses and children, while young people basically get punched in the face non-stop because literally everything they need to buy has exploded in price. In fact, the only thing that actually affects old people too is healthcare, but they are the ones who can pay for it. Enough data for your feelings yet? One more. Here is the thing that should have blown neoliberalism up by now: debts. As soon as income stopped rising after Reagan became president and people weren't able to save anymore, the missing American dream was feathered out by more and more debts. In fact, this happened everywhere. As the financial sector became unleashed and credit became cheaper, people replaced their lacking incomes by debts, not only in the US but also in Europe. And now imagine what happens when trust in this whole system collapses.
These two words on the American front
As
lawn,
people
do they
couldn't
now
afford
have
to
the-
unironically buy houses anymore, the worldwide real estate bubble burst. Banks couldn't perform routine repo transactions anymore, meaning they couldn't trade other debts for cash anymore. Credit dried up, as people suddenly couldn't afford to feather out their stagnant incomes anymore. The economy entered a downturn. With things looking bad and money getting anxious, it only took one tiny bank to go insolvent. The absurd amounts of money that were circulating the globe now turned to panic.
43%.
In the wildfire of sell-offs, every single neoliberal bubble burst.
We're in the last days of this country surviving.
People were now unemployed, angry and unable to pay back their credit. Credit they shouldn't have gotten in the first place. With anger becoming louder, neoliberalism came under fire. People started admitting that they had been at fault. Had the ideology of the free market perhaps been wrong? Had we perhaps misconceived the entire system? Change really did seem to be coming. A better, more social world was possible. You think. It's not the system that had been wrong. We simply hadn't done it hard enough. Once more, the solution was more neoliberalism and not less. Banks' mistakes were now socialized, and states spent all the money they had on bailing out the messed up banking sector, meanwhile indebting themselves through the roof. The incomes of the poorest people now fell, while the rich, who were the ones responsible, got off without any harm. But if you're like me and remember early 2010 television, debt was the fault of the lazy and unproductive. These faults had to be repaid, and all belts had to be tightened. Problem being, some of us wear really large pants. Neoliberalism was back in action, and if you didn't benefit from it, well, too bad. Is it really that surprising that people are angry today? When you have been promised a dream that your parents got, and you get older and older, and you realize that that dream has kind of been a lie, wouldn't you get angry too? But the deep story behind why people vote for parties that are the exact opposite of what they would actually need, if I may say that, is still a fascinating one. Think of it like this. People feel like they are waiting in a line, a pilgrimage, so to speak, to the top of a hill. The American dream or the European dream, the deeply human need for progress. But this line is not moving, and this is fundamentally the fault of neoliberalism. But it doesn't feel like it. Their feet are becoming tired, but they feel like they just have to try a bit harder. And then they see people cutting the line. Blacks now empowered through affirmative action. Women now equal at the workplace. Immigrants and refugees taking their jobs. And now even Greta Thunberg and the climate. You have nothing against these people, in principle, but why should they be empowered when you are trying your best too? Watching over all of this is the liberal elite. The Obamas, the Macrons, the Merkels of this world. They don't know how you are feeling, and it feels like they are waving everyone through except you. And then you suffer, silently. Perhaps you watch YouTube videos of people confirming what you've been feeling all the time, where people tell you of hierarchies with you at the top, or feminists getting owned. It's perhaps compensation for the embarrassment you feel for not being where you feel you should be. And this goes on, dragging itself out, until someone comes from the top of that hill and says, I know how you are feeling. They don't care about the establishment, they simply say it as it is. They tell your deep story as you experience it, and it doesn't matter if liberals don't like it. Now it is time to turn the clock back, to send all these people who have cut the line back to the place where they belong. Own these lips. The almighty leader has given you what you want, your pride back. the world is fair again, and you are back at the place where you belong. Now you only have to wait a bit longer, and you will feel like you have achieved the dream. If only the line moved faster.
Denn wovon lebt der Mensch, indem stündlich den Menschen peinigt, anfällt, auszieht, abwirkt und flieht?